I never thought my life would unravel the way it did. Looking back now, I realize how blind I was, how easily I trusted her, how deeply I believed in us. My name is Daniel Harper, and this is a story about love, betrayal, and revenge. It's not pretty. It's raw, cold, and painful. But if you're reading this, maybe you'll understand why I became what I became. It all started on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The sun filtered through our bedroom curtains as I woke up to the smell of coffee brewing downstairs. That was Emily's routine, always making coffee before heading out for work. She had recently taken a job at a small cafe called Brew Haven, just 2 blocks away from our apartment. At first, I didn't think much of it. She said she needed something to fill her days while I worked long hours at the architectural firm downtown. And honestly, I was relieved. Her smile seemed brighter those mornings when she left for work. But there were little things that gnawed at me, tiny cracks forming beneath the surface of our seemingly perfect marriage. Like how she started wearing more makeup than usual, not too much, but enough to notice. Or how she'd come home later each evening, claiming they were busy training new staff or closing up shop. Sometimes, she'd bring home pastries from the cafe, saying, "A coworker baked these. They insisted I share them with you." "A coworker?" I asked once, trying to sound casual. "What's their name?" "Oh, just someone named Jake," she replied with a shrug, brushing crumbs off her fingers. "He's nice. You'd like him." Jake. The name stuck in my mind like a splinter I couldn't remove. Nice? Sure. Friendly? Probably. But something about the way she said his name made my stomach tighten. Still, I pushed the feeling aside. We were happy, or so I told myself. That night, as we sat together on the couch watching some forgettable movie, Emily leaned into me, resting her head on my shoulder. For a moment, everything felt right again. The world outside faded away, leaving only the warmth of her presence beside me. "I'm lucky to have you," she whispered softly, almost dreamily, and I believed her. How could I have known then that those words carried no truth? How could I have guessed that behind every gentle touch, every sweet smile, there was a lie waiting to shatter me? As weeks turned into months, the cracks in our marriage began to widen. At first, they were subtle, almost imperceptible, but over time, they grew impossible to ignore. Emily's behavior changed in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. She became distant, distracted, as though her mind was always somewhere else. It started with small things, like how she stopped asking about my day at work, or forgot little details we used to share without thinking twice. One evening, I mentioned a big presentation I had coming up, a project I'd been pouring my heart into for weeks. Her response was lukewarm at best. "That's nice, Dan," she said absent-mindedly, scrolling through her phone. "I'm sure it'll go great." Nice? That was all she had to say? I stared at her, stunned by the lack of enthusiasm. This wasn't the Emily I knew, the woman who used to cheer me on, who made me feel like I could conquer the world. Where had that version of her gone? Then there were the calls. They came at odd hours, usually when I was home. Emily would glance at her phone, her face lighting up briefly before she silenced it and slipped the device into her pocket. When I asked who it was, she brushed me off with a laugh. "Oh, just spam," she'd say, avoiding eye contact. You know how annoying those telemarketers can be. But something about the way she hesitated made my chest tighten. Spam? Really? Why did her voice waver whenever she said it? One Saturday afternoon, I decided to surprise her at the cafe. It had been weeks since I'd seen her during her shift, and I thought bringing her lunch might brighten her day. As I approached Brew Haven, the smell of freshly ground coffee beans filled the air. Through the large glass windows, I spotted Emily behind the counter, chatting animatedly with a man I assumed was Jake. He was tall, with dark hair and an easy smile that seemed to come naturally. He leaned casually against the espresso machine, his body language relaxed yet confident. Emily laughed at something he said, her head tilted back slightly, her expression radiant. It was a side of her I hadn't seen in months, not with me anyway. For a moment, I stood frozen outside the cafe, watching them interact. There was nothing overtly inappropriate about their conversation, but something felt off. The way Jake looked at her, it wasn't just friendly. And the way Emily responded to him, it wasn't just polite. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. Was I imagining things? Overreacting? Maybe. But deep down, a seed of doubt had taken root, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, it refused to die. I forced myself to enter the cafe, plastering a smile onto my face. The bell above the door jingled softly as I stepped inside. Emily turned toward me, her eyes widening in surprise. "Dan, what are you doing here?" she asked, her tone caught somewhere between delight and unease. "I brought you lunch," I said, holding up the paper bag. "Thought I'd surprise you." Her smile faltered for a split second before she recovered. "That's so sweet. Thanks." Jake glanced at me then, his gaze assessing. "This must be your husband," he said smoothly, extending a hand. "I've heard a lot about you." His grip was firm, almost too firm, as if he wanted to prove something. I nodded stiffly, forcing myself to maintain eye contact. "And you're Jake, right? Emily's co-worker?" "That's me," he replied with a grin. "Thanks for sharing her with us. She's been a real asset to the team." The words sounded harmless enough, but the underlying tone sent a chill down my spine. Sharing her? Since when did anyone need permission to share their spouse? Emily quickly intervened, sensing the tension. "Well, I should probably take this break now. Let me grab my coat." She disappeared into the back room, leaving me alone with Jake. An awkward silence settled between us, heavy and suffocating. Finally, he spoke again, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "You're a lucky guy, Dan. Not everyone gets someone like Emily." I forced a tight smile, my jaw clenched so hard it ached. "Yeah, I am." When Emily returned, she seemed eager to leave, practically dragging me out the door. As we walked back to the apartment, she chattered nervously about work, barely pausing for breath. I listened, or pretended to listen, but my thoughts were elsewhere. What was going on between her and Jake? Was I being paranoid, or was there really something to worry about? That night, as Emily slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer. For the first time in years, I felt truly alone, even with her lying just inches away. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening. I had stayed late at the office, buried under piles of blueprints and deadlines. By the time I got home, the apartment was dark and silent. Emily wasn't there. At first, I wasn't alarmed. She often worked late shifts at the cafe, and sometimes she met up with friends afterward. But as the hours ticked by and she still hadn't returned, unease began to creep in. It wasn't like her to stay out this late without calling. I tried reaching her on her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Each unanswered call sent another wave of anxiety crashing over me. Something wasn't right. Finally, around midnight, I decided to drive back to Brewhaven. If she wasn't there, maybe someone could tell me where she'd gone. The streets were slick with rain, reflecting the glow of streetlights as I navigated through the empty city. When I arrived at the cafe, it was closed, its windows dark and lifeless. But then I noticed something, a faint light coming from the alley beside the building. My heart pounded as I parked the car and stepped out into the cold drizzle. The sound of my footsteps echoed against the wet pavement as I approached the source of the light. What I saw next shattered me. Emily was there, standing close to Jake under the dim glow of a security lamp. They weren't just talking, they were laughing, their bodies angled toward each other in a way that felt intimate, familiar. Jake reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering longer than necessary. Emily didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled softly, her eyes meeting his with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in months. My breath caught in my throat. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet as realization crashed over me like a tidal wave. This wasn't innocent. This wasn't friendship. They hadn't noticed me yet, so I stepped back into the shadows, my mind racing. Betrayal burned through me, hot and searing, leaving behind a cold emptiness. How long had this been going on? Weeks? Months? Had every smile, every kind word she'd given me been a lie? I wanted to confront them, to scream, to demand answers, but something stopped me. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was pride. Or maybe it was the icy resolve that began to take hold in my chest. Instead of stepping forward, I turned and walked away, letting the rain soak through my clothes. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I drove home in silence, the image of them together replaying in my mind like a broken record. When Emily finally walked through the door an hour later, soaked and shivering, I was waiting for her. She froze when she saw me sitting in the dark, my face unreadable. "Dan," she said hesitantly, her voice trembling, "why are you still awake?" I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I stood slowly, my movements deliberate and controlled. Every muscle in my body felt taut, like a bowstring pulled to its limit. "I went to the cafe tonight," I said quietly, my voice devoid of emotion. "You weren't there." Her eyes widened, panic flickering across her features. "What do you mean? Why would you go there?" "Because you weren't answering your phone," I replied, taking a step closer. "And because I needed to know the truth." "The truth about what?" she asked, though her voice wavered, betraying her guilt. I stared at her, searching her face for any trace of remorse, any sign that she might deny it. But all I saw was fear, and something else. Shame. "You were with him, weren't you?" I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Jake." She flinched at his name, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of her secret had finally become too heavy to bear. For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze dropping to the floor. Then, barely audible, she whispered, "Yes." That single word hit me like a punch to the gut. All the anger, all the hurt I'd been holding back surged to the surface, threatening to consume me. But instead of exploding, I forced myself to stay calm, cold, calculating. "How long?" I asked, my tone eerily steady. She hesitated before answering, tears streaming down her face. "A few months." Months. The word echoed in my mind, hollow and devastating. While I had been working tirelessly to build a future for us, she had been building one with someone else. I turned away from her then, unable to look at her anymore. My thoughts raced, fragments of memories flashing before my eyes. Our wedding day, lazy Sunday mornings, promises made under starlit skies. None of it mattered now. It had all been a lie. As I stood there, numb and broken, a plan began to form in my mind. Revenge wouldn't bring back what we had lost, but it would give me something else: control, justice, closure, and I would make sure they both paid dearly for what they had done. The days that followed were a blur of emotion and restraint. I moved through life like a ghost, my actions mechanical, my thoughts consumed by one singular purpose: revenge. Emily tried to talk to me after her confession, her voice trembling with guilt and regret. She begged for forgiveness, pleaded for a chance to explain herself. But I didn't listen, not really. Her words meant nothing to me now. They couldn't undo what had been done. Instead, I retreated into myself, constructing a wall of icy detachment around my heart. Every interaction between us became transactional, polite but distant. We shared the same space, ate meals at the same table, slept in the same bed, yet we might as well have been strangers. The warmth that once defined our relationship was gone, replaced by an unspoken tension that hung heavy in the air. But beneath my calm exterior, my mind was a storm of calculation. I spent hours poring over details, piecing together their betrayal like a puzzle. I wanted to know everything: their routines, their habits, their weaknesses. If I was going to make them pay, I needed to understand them completely. I started small, gathering information without drawing suspicion. I memorized Emily's schedule at the cafe, noting when she worked late or left early. I observed Jake from afar, studying his mannerisms and interactions with others. He seemed charming enough on the surface, but there was a cockiness about him that grated on my nerves. It wasn't hard to see why Emily had fallen for him. He exuded confidence, the kind that could easily mask arrogance. One evening, while Emily was out running errands, I took the opportunity to snoop through her belongings. My hands shook as I rifled through drawers and cabinets, searching for anything that might reveal more about their affair. In the back of her nightstand, tucked beneath a stack of old receipts, I found it: a crumpled piece of paper with Jake's phone number scribbled hastily in her handwriting. My stomach churned as I stared at the digits, each one feeling like a fresh stab to the chest. This wasn't just evidence of infidelity. It was proof of her deliberate deception. She had hidden this part of her life from me, keeping secrets even within the walls of our home. With the number in hand, I began to dig deeper. Using burner phones and fake accounts, I traced Jake's social media profiles, piecing together fragments of his life outside the cafe. He lived alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, frequented local bars, and often posted photos of himself posing with coworkers, including Emily. Seeing her smiling face next to his made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay focused. Emotions wouldn't serve me here. Only logic would. As I gathered more information, a plan began to crystallize in my mind. Revenge wasn't enough. It had to be calculated, precise. I wanted them to feel the full weight of their betrayal, to experience the same pain they had inflicted on me. And I knew exactly how to do it. Jake's Achilles heel became clear almost immediately. His ego. He thrived on admiration, validation, the attention of those around him. Without it, he would crumble. Emily, on the other hand, was driven by fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being exposed. Together, they formed a fragile partnership, one that could be dismantled with the right amount of pressure. By the end of the week, I had mapped out every step of my plan. It was risky, yes, but also foolproof, if executed correctly. I rehearsed conversations in my head, anticipated their reactions, prepared for any curveballs they might throw my way. There would be no room for error. On Saturday morning, I woke up before dawn, my resolve stronger than ever. Today marked the beginning of the end, for both of them. As I dressed quietly in the dim light of our bedroom, I glanced at Emily sleeping beside me. Her face looked peaceful, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. For a fleeting moment, I considered sparing her. After all, she was still my wife, or at least, she used to be. But then I remembered the nights I'd spent lying awake, wondering where she was, who she was with. I thought of the lies she'd told, the promises she'd broken. And just like that, my hesitation vanished. This wasn't personal anymore. It was justice. The first step of my plan was simple but crucial: isolation. If I wanted to dismantle their relationship and make them both suffer, I needed to separate them, even if only temporarily. Jake thrived on attention, and Emily relied on his validation. Cutting off that connection would leave them vulnerable, exposed. I decided to start with Jake. Using the burner phone I'd purchased weeks earlier, I sent him a text message disguised as an anonymous tip. It read, "Hey Jake, just a heads up, your manager's been talking about cutting hours at Brewhaven. Heard they're reviewing employee performance records this week. Might want to watch your back." It wasn't much, but it planted a seed of paranoia in his mind. People like Jake hated uncertainty. They craved stability and control. A vague threat to his job would be enough to throw him off balance, making him less focused on Emily and more concerned with saving himself. Sure enough, within hours, I noticed a shift in his behavior. When Emily arrived at the cafe later that day, he barely acknowledged her presence. Instead, he hovered anxiously around the register, double-checking receipts and restocking shelves with unnecessary vigor. From my usual spot across the street, I watched as she approached him, confusion etched across her face. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Nothing," he snapped, avoiding eye contact. "Just busy, okay?" Emily recoiled slightly, clearly taken aback by his coldness. For a moment, she stood there, unsure of what to do next. Then, with a defeated sigh, she turned back to her tasks, her shoulders slumped. Seeing her reaction filled me with a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. Part of me still cared for her, despite everything. But another part, the colder, angrier part, relished her discomfort. She had chosen this path, after all. Now she would have to walk it alone. With Jake distracted, I turned my attention to Emily. Her growing unease was palpable, though she tried to hide it behind forced smiles and hollow laughter. At home, she avoided discussing work altogether, brushing off my questions with vague answers. One evening, as we sat silently at the dinner table, I decided to push her further. You seem different lately, I said casually, setting down my fork. Is everything okay at the cafe? She hesitated, her fork hovering mid-air. Yeah, fine. Just tired, I guess. Jake treating you all right? I added, watching her closely. Her hand twitched slightly, betraying her nerves. Why wouldn't he be? No reason, I replied, shrugging. Just checking. The tension between us thickened, suffocating. Emily quickly changed the subject, rambling about some new coffee blend they were testing at work. But I could see the cracks forming, the doubt creeping into her thoughts. Good. Let her wonder. Let her worry. Over the next few days, I continued to manipulate the situation from afar. I sent Jake another anonymous message, this time hinting at rumors of favoritism among the staff. By Friday, he was visibly agitated, snapping at customers and avoiding conversations with anyone who might question his loyalty to the cafe. Meanwhile, Emily grew increasingly withdrawn. Her attempts to reach out to him met with indifference or outright hostility. Their bond was unraveling faster than I'd anticipated, and it gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. Still, I knew this was only the beginning. Breaking them apart emotionally was one thing, but true revenge required something deeper, more lasting. That weekend, I made my next move. While Emily was out grocery shopping, I slipped into her purse and retrieved her phone. Unlocking it was easier than expected. She hadn't changed the passcode since our anniversary last year. Once inside, I scrolled through her messages, searching for anything incriminating. What I found confirmed my suspicions, and then some. Hidden beneath layers of deleted texts and archived chats were countless exchanges between her and Jake, detailing not just their affair but also plans for the future. They had talked about leaving town together, starting fresh somewhere no one knew them. My chest tightened as I read their words, each sentence a dagger to my already shattered heart. How could she have planned this without a second thought, without considering the life we had built, or the man she had vowed to stand by? But anger quickly replaced grief. This wasn't just betrayal, it was abandonment. And now, armed with undeniable proof, I had everything I needed to take my revenge to the next level. Before she returned home, I carefully placed her phone back where I'd found it, ensuring nothing seemed out of place. Then, I sat down at my laptop and began drafting an email, a message designed to shatter whatever remained of their fragile partnership. By the time Emily walked through the door, humming softly to herself, I was ready. The email was my masterpiece, a carefully crafted weapon designed to strike at the heart of their relationship. I knew exactly how to play on Jake's insecurities and Emily's fears, exploiting the cracks I had already created between them. I sent it from an anonymous account, making sure it would reach both of their inboxes simultaneously. The subject line read simply, "You should know." Inside, I included screenshots of their private messages, the ones I had uncovered on Emily's phone, alongside a brief note written in a tone of mock concern. Thought you too might want to see this. Looks like someone isn't being entirely honest. Maybe it's time to ask yourselves who you can really trust. It was vague enough to leave room for doubt, but damning enough to plant seeds of suspicion. By withholding specific details, I ensured they would turn on each other, questioning every word, every action. Within hours, the fallout began. Emily called me at work, her voice trembling with panic. "Dan, something weird just happened. I got this email. It has screenshots of texts between me and Jake. Someone hacked my phone." I feigned surprise, keeping my tone calm and measured. "Are you sure? Did you click on any links or give out your password recently?" "No, nothing like that," she stammered. "But why would anyone do this? Who even knows about us?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a moment, guilt flickered in my chest. But I pushed it aside, reminding myself of the pain she had caused me. This wasn't personal, it was justice. "I don't know, Em," I said evenly. "Maybe it's best if you talk to Jake about it. He might have some answers." She hesitated before responding. Yeah, maybe you're right." Meanwhile, Jake reacted exactly as I had predicted. Within minutes of receiving the email, he confronted Emily during a break at the cafe. Their argument spilled into the alley behind Brew Haven, loud enough for passers-by to overhear. "What is this crap?" Jake demanded, shoving his phone in her face. These texts, are they real? Yes, but Emily started, only to be cut off. But what? Were you planning to run away with me while lying to your husband the whole time? Or were you using me as some kind of backup plan? That's not fair, she shot back, tears streaming down her face. You knew how complicated things were. You said you understood. Understood? He spat, his voice rising. You think I'm stupid? Do you have any idea how this makes me look? If this gets out, my reputation is ruined. Their voices echoed through the narrow alleyway, raw and unfiltered. From my hiding spot across the street, I watched as their relationship unraveled before my eyes. Every accusation, every denial, it was music to my ears. By the end of the day, they weren't speaking to each other. Emily returned home visibly shaken, her makeup smeared from crying. She didn't say a word to me as she retreated to our bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Jake, on the other hand, called in sick the next morning, unable to face the scrutiny of his co-workers, or Emily. His absence only fueled the gossip mill at Brew Haven, further eroding whatever credibility he had left. As the days passed, their lives spiraled into chaos. Emily became withdrawn, barely leaving the apartment except to go to work. Even then, she avoided Jake like the plague, sticking to menial tasks that kept her out of sight. Meanwhile, Jake grew increasingly erratic, lashing out at anyone who dared question him. And me? I stood back, watching it all unfold with cold satisfaction. With Emily and Jake's relationship in tatters, I turned my focus inward, to Emily herself. While Jake's downfall was satisfying, it wasn't enough. She needed to feel the full weight of her betrayal, to understand the consequences of her actions. I began subtly manipulating her environment, planting doubts and fears wherever I could. One evening, after she fell asleep on the couch, I slipped a note under her pillow. It read, "Do you really think you can fix this? Some mistakes can't be undone." When she found it the next morning, her hands trembled as she held the paper. She glanced around the room, searching for signs of intrusion, but there were none, just the lingering sense that someone, or something, was watching her. Over the following days, I left similar notes in random places, tucked inside her purse, taped to the bathroom mirror, even scrawled lightly on the fogged-up window after a shower. Each message was cryptic yet pointed, designed to keep her off balance. He'll never forgive you. How long until everyone finds out? What will you do when you're alone? At first, she tried to rationalize them, convincing herself they were pranks or coincidences. But as the notes piled up, her composure began to crack. She stopped sleeping soundly, waking frequently in the middle of the night to check the locks on the doors and windows. Her appetite dwindled, and dark circles formed beneath her eyes. One night, she finally confronted me. "Dan, are you doing this?" she asked, her voice shaky but accusatory. "The notes, did you write them?" I looked up from the book I was reading, feigning confusion. "What notes?" "The ones I keep finding everywhere. Someone's messing with me, and it has to be you." "Why would I do that?" I replied calmly, meeting her gaze. "You've made it clear I'm not important to you anymore." Her face flushed with frustration, but she couldn't argue. Deep down, she knew I was right. Desperate for answers, she confided in a coworker at the cafe, a well-meaning barista named Claire. But instead of offering comfort, Claire unknowingly worsened the situation by mentioning rumors she'd heard about Emily and Jake. "People are talking, Em," Claire said cautiously. "They think you're the reason Jake's acting so weird lately. Are you sure everything's okay between you two?" Emily froze, her mind racing. Had Jake told others about their affair? Was their secret already out? That night, she broke down completely, sobbing uncontrollably in the kitchen. I stood in the doorway, watching silently as she unraveled. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, clutching her head in her hands. "I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's falling apart." For the first time since discovering her betrayal, I felt a pang of pity, but it was fleeting. She had brought this on herself. With Emily teetering on the edge, I prepared to deliver the final blow, one that would ensure neither she nor Jake could ever recover from what they had done. Using the same burner phone I'd used to harass Jake, I reached out to Emily's family. Her sister, Sarah, had always been fiercely protective of her, and I knew she wouldn't hesitate to intervene if she believed Emily was in danger. The text I sent was short and alarming. "Hey, Sarah. It's Dan. Something's wrong with Emily. She's been acting strange lately, paranoid, distant. I think she might be involved with someone at work, and it's affecting her mental health. Can you check on her?" Within hours, Sarah arrived at our apartment, her expression a mix of concern and suspicion. "Emily, we need to talk," she said firmly, pulling her aside. Reluctantly, Emily agreed, though her body language screamed reluctance. Over coffee, Sarah pressed her for details, asking pointed questions about her job, her relationship with Jake, and her marriage to me. At first, Emily deflected, trying to downplay the situation. But Sarah wasn't easily deterred. Listen to me," she said, her voice softening. "If something's going on, you can tell me. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as the walls she had built around herself began to crumble. Slowly, haltingly, she confessed everything: the affair, the lies, the guilt that had consumed her for months. Sarah listened quietly, her face unreadable. When Emily finished, she sighed deeply. "You need to come clean, Em," she said gently but firmly. "To Dan, to Jake, to everyone. Secrets like this, they eat away at you. You deserve better than living in fear." Emily nodded weakly, but I could see the dread in her eyes. She knew the truth would destroy what little remained of her life. The next day, she called me into the living room, her hands shaking as she clutched a folded piece of paper. "Dan, I need to tell you something," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About me and Jake." I sat down across from her, maintaining a neutral expression. "Go ahead." For the next 10 minutes, she poured her heart out, confessing every detail of her betrayal. By the time she finished, tears streamed down her face, and her voice was hoarse from emotion. When she looked at me expectantly, waiting for a reaction, I simply stood and walked away without saying a word. In the days that followed Emily's confession, the weight of her actions finally caught up with her. Word spread quickly among her friends and family, leaving her isolated and humiliated. Sarah distanced herself, unable to reconcile the sister she loved with the person who had betrayed her husband. Co-workers at Brew Haven whispered behind her back, casting judgmental glances whenever she entered the room. Jake, meanwhile, hit rock bottom. With his reputation in ruins and no one willing to defend him, he quit his job and disappeared from town altogether. Rumors circulated about where he had gone, but no one seemed to care. As for me, I moved through life with a sense of detached resolve. Emily and I separated shortly after her confession, dividing our assets and cutting ties. The apartment we had once shared felt empty now, its walls echoing with memories I could no longer bear. But revenge came at a cost. Though I had achieved what I set out to do, I couldn't escape the emptiness that lingered in my heart. The anger that had driven me for so long began to fade, replaced by a quiet sadness. One evening, as I sat alone in the dim light of the living room, I realized something profound. Revenge hadn't healed me. It had only deepened the wound. Months later, I found myself standing outside a small park near the cafe where it all began. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. Children laughed in the distance, their joy a stark contrast to the heaviness I still carried. I thought about Emily often, about the life we had lost and the choices that had led us here. In quieter moments, I wondered if forgiveness was possible, not for her sake, but for mine. Holding on to anger had become exhausting, a burden I no longer wanted to carry. Eventually, I decided to visit her. She lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, far removed from the life she had once known. When she opened the door, her eyes widened in surprise. "Dan," she said softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see you," I replied, my tone steady but gentle. "To talk." We sat together in her tiny living room, surrounded by boxes half-packed for a move she had planned. For the first time in years, we spoke honestly, not as enemies, but as two people trying to make sense of the wreckage. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice breaking, "for everything. I nodded, acknowledging her apology without resentment. I know. We parted ways that day with a fragile understanding, not reconciliation, but closure. As I walked away, I felt lighter, as though a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally lifted. Revenge may have given me control, but forgiveness gave me peace. And in the end, that was worth more than anything else.